Breaking news in Mets world, they have just signed Clay Holmes, the Yankees closer and ex-closer of their past 3 seasons, to a 3-year, $38 million deal with an opt-out after the second season. Another ex-Yankee coming over to the Mets, pitching specifically, like Luis Severino last year. And the first thought that many people are having is that kind of feels like starting pitcher money. $13 million average annual value is a decent amount for someone who's going to be a setup guy. And there have been reports that Clay Holmes was going to be worked out and looked at as a starter by many teams. The Mets get the winning bid, so this could go a couple of different ways. It's a very, very interesting signing. I'm still trying to wrap my brain around it as I give you my instant reaction here. My initial thought was, okay, it's a hefty price tag for someone who could be a great bridge guy to Edwin Diaz. For those who don't know, Clay Holmes was 100th percentile in ground ball rate last year, and the Mets specialized in sinker ball pitchers last year to work with their great infield defense. Guys like Severino, who were traditionally strikeout pitchers, were converted to ground ball specialists, and their numbers got a lot better because of that. Clay Holmes could fit that profile as well. A lot of the blown saves that he had last year, 11, which led Major League Baseball, were due to the fact that the Yankees infield defense often let him down. And if you're taking that as a Mets fan just trying to spin this a positive way, go listen to any Talkin' Yanks episode after a bad Yankees blown save loss. That's usually one of the first comments that Jimmy or Jake will make. Looking at Clay Holmes' numbers, he consistently has thrown 60 innings over the past 3 seasons. The ERA has steadily gone up, but these are pretty solid numbers as a reliever. The 1.3 whip from last year is a little bit worrisome, but a two-time All-Star after he came over from Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh, that very first year in 2018 was his only experience with starting pitching. He started 4 games that year before he was moved to the bullpen. So it's been quite a long time since Clay Holmes has not pitched out of the bullpen. So I'm really curious, but also I just want to preface this by saying that David Stearns has fully earned my trust with his pitching lab and his pitching development and strategy. Their Mets are going to exercise and use him as a starter. So this screams to me, I think they're still going to add another starter, and there's still a ton on the market left to add. I don't think Clay Holmes is the big get. This is going to be quite the experiment. I don't know off the top of my head that if Stearns ever tried something like this in his time with the Brewers, taking guys that are traditionally relievers and then using them as starters. What I do know that he did is he would take struggling starters in the Brewers system, like Corbin Burns, for example, move them to the bullpen, and then eventually graduate them back to the rotation when he felt that they were ready and developed enough. I find it especially perplexing because despite the fiascos that he underwent last year as closer of the Yankees, the past 3 years, Holmes has been a top 10 valued reliever in terms of F4. He's actually 11th on the list in terms of WAR, but 189 innings over the last 3 years to the tune of nearly 4 WAR. That's right up there with the likes of Felix Bautista and Edwin Diaz, both of whom had injuries, but also Tanner Scott, Devin Williams, like elite closers of the game. If this guy is your setup guy, that's a great spot to be in. So I think what the Mets did here was they gave themselves another starting pitching option, which they now seem to have plenty of, just not a lot of top end talent, which they didn't have last year going into the year either. And if things don't work out with Holmes as a starter, which I'm going to be honest with you right now, I can't picture it. I really do. I don't see that, panning out, if I'm being completely honest. Even when the reports hit initially, I was like, what? If it doesn't work out, like some of us might suspect, then your fallback is you have an expensive setup guy who is a proven quantity in that role, and you take him out of the pressure of being the closer, and you put him in a role where he's not going to be because the highest paid closer of all time is already on the roster. Obviously, the big development that the Yankees did when they brought Holmes over from Pittsburgh was they converted his hard slider into a sweeper, which turned into a much more valuable whiff pitch for Holmes. That probably would have been one of the steps of the process if they hadn't done it already, if the Mets got their hands on Holmes. Obviously, a very high whiff rate on that pitch as well, 38% to be specific, and he still played off his regular slider as well. Now, obviously, everyone's going to get their jabs, and between the Mets getting an ex-Yankees closer, there's going to be finger pointing at this signing. And I think all Mets fans knew that as soon as they read the headline. But the upside here is pretty good. I mean, I think the Mets have done a really good job in their recent signings of providing themselves a safety net of sorts, whether it was giving Severino just the 1 year, all the opt outs that have been laden in their deals, including the Manaea mutual option, which he did not exercise after things went so well for him last year. The Mets have done a really good job of protecting themselves, and they have protected themselves in this deal, not so much by the structuring of the contract, but rather the abilities of the player that they signed here. This is a guy that apparently has starting pitcher capability, which again is still a little shocking to me. And if things don't work out the way the Mets think that they will, you have a pretty valuable setup reliever as well. And I mean, for all the talk that goes on about Clay Holmes in a Yankee uniform, he ends his Yankee tenure with a 2.69 ERA in over 200 innings with a whip of 1.12, a strikeout per nine near 10. I mean, these are really good numbers, and he's a sinker ball specialist, a ground ball first guy that keeps the ball in the ballpark. And I think he's going to be pitching to a much better infield defense with fielders like Lindor behind him, Jeff McNeil behind him, potentially a new face at first base. We don't know where it's going to come of that yet. I also want to say that none of what the Mets have done has taken them out of the running for anything, in my opinion. I mean, they've traded for Jose Siri, they've invested about $60 million in Frankie Montas and Clay Holmes. I don't think that hampers their ability to do big moves at all. As we all know, they entered this offseason with about $170 million coming off their payroll. They've now spent, by my calculation, about $30 million of that. So a little bit like around a sixth of the percent. I'm not saying they're going to spend it all. They'll probably need to allocate money for the trade deadline and stuff like that, but they still have a big move, maybe even two in the tank, which is another reason why I like this signing. You're giving yourselves the chance to get a guy who has obvious arm talent and potential upside as a starting pitcher. And if this does pan out, it could potentially become a crazy value contract that you get for at least 2 years before that opt-out hits. Also, ever since the addition of Kodai Senga, the Mets pitching staff has been very interested in adding splitters to the arsenals of their pitchers. Most notably, Tyler McGill developed his splitter, and while he didn't have a great year, he came up pretty big towards the end of the year when the Mets needed starting pitching, and his splitter was a big reason why. I think Holmes could be a guy that fits that profile as well, being that he's already a sinker ball specialist, because the sinker-splitter combo can work really well if you want to generate more whiffs instead of just relying solely on ground balls for Clay Holmes to get the majority of his outs. Now, I also am worried about where things stand with Sean Manaea now, because this indicates to me that his price tag is high, and the Mets are exploring safety options in case they aren't able to lock him down to a new contract. Right now, they have feasibly, if they are exercising Holmes as a starter, four guys that I think will be locked in to the April rotation. I think they're going to add a top end guy, whether it's Corbin Burns, Max Fried, Roki, maybe. I feel like I haven't heard a lot of Roki to the Mets stuff at all. And then potentially one other guy in case there's an injury or they want to go with the six-man rotation. And hopefully that other guy would be a bigger contract for Sean Manaea, who I think wants to stay, found the best version of himself with the Mets. And I think everyone on all sides, between fans and ownership and then the player himself, would be very happy to see that reunion come to fruition. But the more the Mets invest in pitching, the less good I feel about it, because we saw them sign Montas and then we almost immediately saw Severino leave right after for a similar AAV, but a larger deal. The same could be said for Manaea. Manaea might not get this crazy AAV, but I wouldn't be shocked at all if he gets a 4-year deal, maybe even a 5-year deal. And I'm sure there's a lot of teams that need starting pitching. Starting pitching wins championships. Every team should always want to sign starting pitching. So the competition is probably pretty fierce for Manaea's services right now. I'm still holding out hope, but this signing did indicate to me that I think the percentages of that reunion happening have gone down. A couple more things looking at Clay Holmes' splits from last year that I really liked. How about this? I didn't know this. He had the exact same OPS against between righties and lefties at 662, so no reverse splits here. He was solid against either side. And most of you know this by now, but his numbers in save situations versus non-save situations were very, very different. In save situations, he had a 3.86 ERA with a whip above 1.5. In non-save situations, an ERA below 2 and a whip below 0.85. So an elite reliever, some of the best numbers in the game when he's not in those high leverage situations, which I don't think under any circumstance the Mets will be putting him in unless there's a barrage of injuries and they need him to fill that role. Last but not least, I really thought Clay Holmes was going to leave New York, but I really thought he would go for a change of scenery, somewhere, a bit quieter, even to sort of rebuild his value and reestablish himself as a closer. But maybe all along, Clay Holmes never viewed himself as a closer. Maybe this is the path he's wanted to take for a while, and the Mets were one of the few teams willing to give him that opportunity. And hey, it's a pretty good situation to try yourself out in that opportunity. So I'm happy for Clay Holmes, the human being. But I am really curious to see how this one pans out. This is going to be one of the most interesting spring training storylines, in my opinion, because who knows what's going to come of this? The Mets specialize in these sinker ball, ground ball pitchers. They're likely going to try and add to his arsenal because I don't think you're going to roll him out there with just three pitches. The Clay Holmes that you see in 2025 is going to be very different from the Clay Holmes that we've seen the past 3 years, which by all accounts has been a good to great MLB reliever. So 3 years, 38 million. The Mets have the cash. They want to do some experimentation. I'm down. Why not? I think they know and the fans know you're leaving yourself subject to a little bit of ridiculing. But you know what? You left yourself subject to ridiculing last year when you gave Severino $13 million. You might as well bark up the same tree again and see what you get, because last year that tree bore some pretty good fruit. So I'm excited. I'm nervous. And I hope that the Mets continue to invest in more pitching, because Clay Holmes and Montas, while they are nice signings in my opinion, that can't be it. And I don't think that will be it, because the Mets have a ton more to spend, and they've shown that they are a titan of free agency year in and year out, and they're becoming a more and more desirable location. Obviously, they're waiting for bigger news right now, but this is at least something to chew on as we await the answers on the Juan Soto sweepstakes. But I think that's all I got on Clay Holmes. Hopefully, this gave you a little bit of insight into what the Mets are expecting out of him and why they decided to make this signing. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. I'm really curious. I'm sure some of you are probably pretty upset with this, pretty confused by this, and I totally understand that. I'm still kind of in the confused boat, but I'm sure 24 hours from now I'll be able to wrap my head around it a little bit more. But yeah, the Mets continue to be crafty and experimental with their signings, but David Stearns has shown us no reason not to trust him, so I'm going to continue to trust him. And that'll be it for my Clay Holmes instant reaction. LFGM.